What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Toro Commercial Mower, and the problem is that we just serviced it, but the engine will not start unless we put gas into the carburetor's throat. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this mower. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. So in the last video, we did all the basic maintenance on this mower, which included replacing the air filter, the spark plug, oil filter, greasing some fittings, and changing the oil. However, when it finally came time to start the engine, it didn't do anything. Now, only after I put some gas in the carburetor's throat did it start and run. This would point to a choke issue on the carb, and in theory, it seemed to be correct because the throttle lever doesn't want to move into the choke position. Now, more than likely, there's an issue with the choke linkage or the choke lever on the carb, so we need to take a closer look at it and see if we can try and fix it. Now, I think I could do this inspection without taking most of the engine apart, but for filming purposes, I want to remove the top cover. This will give us a lot more room and allow more viewing angles so we can see a lot better. The first thing I want to do is take off the recoil assembly, followed by the starter cup. Now, this is the first time I've worked with this particular engine, so I wasn't sure what to remove when taking off this cover. I thought maybe the fuel shutoff valve would stay with the engine, so I removed the switch and also all the caps for fluids. Turns out you really only need to remove the oil cap and the grommet around the filler neck. Since the studs for the recoil are very tall, there's not enough slack in the fuel line to take off the cover, so I need to disconnect the fuel line from the carb and its anchor points. Now, with the fuel line finally free, the last thing to do before taking off the cover is to loosen the intake boot to the airbox, which is also part of the cover. After taking off the cover, some of the spacers came off the studs. Now, don't lose these, otherwise the recoil won't sit correctly on the cover. Now, if I move the throttle back and forth, you can see how the linkages work, or in this case, how it doesn't work. The lever in the back works the choke linkage to the carb, and for some reason, it's not moving. It is trying to move though, so more than likely the issue is on the carb. That means we need to take it off and inspect it for any possible issues. Now, we could try and diagnose it while it's still connected to the engine. However, if we have to fix it, we'll have to take it off anyway. After getting the carb away from the engine, I'm going to try and move the choke flap, but unfortunately it is stuck in the open position, and that's why the engine would not start. Now, the way I'm going to try and fix this is to try and dissolve whatever's keeping the choke flap from rotating inside the carb. After a few minutes, it still didn't budge, so I'm going to have to get physical with it. What I'm doing is trying to work it back and forth so the brake cleaner can work its way into the pivoting points for the choke lever. As you can see, it is working, however, it hasn't broken loose yet. I've never had one stuck this badly before. Now, once I get it moved into the closed position, or as far as I can go, I'll remove the bolts that hold the flap onto the shaft. That way I can slide it out and really clean the bottom pivot, because that's the part that seems to be stuck. Once the flap is gone, I can then slide out the shaft and really clean the plastic pivot and then lubricate the moving parts. Now, this usually happens when the carb is leaking gas. However, the gas would also make its way into the engine oil, and I didn't smell any gas in the oil. We'd also lose all the gas in the tank, but that didn't happen either, so the reason why this flap got stuck is going to have to stay a mystery. After lubricating the bottom pivot and the upper shaft support, I'll reinstall all the components. Now, since this engine does have a fuel shutoff valve, I'll have to remind the owner to use it, otherwise this might happen again. And if it does happen again and they are using the fuel shutoff valve, then I would suggest replacing the carburetor. Otherwise, we'll have to do this every spring. Now, I'm not ready to install the carb to the engine just yet because we have to adjust the throttle cable to make sure that the choke flap is closing all the way. I'm going to use the bolts to hold the carb to the engine. After that, I'll loosen the throttle cable's anchor. I'll then move the throttle lever to the choke position and then move the cable to a point where the choke flap is closed. I'll then tighten the anchor. After that's done, don't forget to test that it's working like it should. You may not get it right the first time, so don't be worried if you have to keep adjusting it. So it seems to be opening and closing completely, which is exactly what we want. Next, I'll remove the bolts and finish installing the intake elbow. Now, the engine was running fine before we fixed the choke flap, but could we have just kept putting gas in the carb's throat to start it? The answer is yes. After the engine is hot, the carb does not need to be choked, so it will start when the engine is hot. It's when the engine is cold that we'd have to put gas in the carb's throat. I wouldn't blame anybody if they did not want to fix it and just lived with this problem. After working on this engine for the first time, I'd have to say it's not a bad design. However, I do have a couple of issues with it. The first is having the oil dipstick pass through the top cover. It makes it look cleaner, but it's kind of a hassle. The same goes for the integrated cover and fuel tank. But the biggest issue I have with this engine is the intake boot that has to be clamped to the bottom of the cover. There's not a lot of room, and the boot is very likely to tear as it's not very thick. Overall, though, this is a great engine, and I don't mind its interesting design because I know as long as I keep changing the oil, it's going to last a long time. After we get the starter cup and the recoil assembly back onto the engine, we'll be ready to start it, and hopefully it'll start without any issues. Well, that was kind of embarrassing. After trying to figure out why it wasn't starting, it turns out the fuel shutoff valve was closed. When I was installing the switch for the valve closed when I was tightening the screw. After fixing the choke flap, it looks like the engine is starting just fine now, and it turns out the fuel valve is also working as well. Now, since this engine does have a valve, I would always suggest closing it and letting it run until it dies. If that's not an option and you have to shut it down immediately, at least close the valve to keep the carb from gumming up. The one thing I will say about this mower is it's lighter than its 2-cycle version and the later version with the larger Kawasaki engine. That makes this mower a lot easier to maneuver and it won't beat you up while you're using it. So my question is, would you want to get the choke working normally, or would you just live with the problem and just keep a bottle of gas to squirt into the engine whenever it was cold? Personally, it would be quite annoying for me to keep adding gas to the carb when the engine was cold, so I would definitely have to get it fixed the right way. However, if I didn't know how to fix it or couldn't pay to have it fixed, I'd have to live with the problem. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.